Hello, lovely people. I was asked to read an excerpt from Ghosts of Timeless Cottage by T K Geering, aka me. It's on Kindle, so I've had to print it off to make for ease of reading from it. So here we go. Ghosts of Timeless Cottage, Chapter 1. Today just couldn't get any worse for Carolina. Her efficiency had gone straight down the toilet. It wasn't her fault, and this morning she seemed to be wearing the Buck Stops Here t-shirt. The newly elected minister, the Right Honourable Jonathan Taylor, constantly upset her carefully maintained schedules. For the last 6 months, most of the female staff had drooled over him and his good looks. Carolina, on the other hand, was completely indifferent. Her efficiency was more of a priority. She was responsible for everything, from running his diary to ensuring his wife and mistress didn't meet. Somehow the fates were on her side with the latter. This morning he had pushed her to the limit. He had come in late and completely thrown out her schedule, which he had known about in advance. His diary read 9 o'clock, meeting with the media, including a TV interview. 10:20, meeting with the Permanent Under Secretary of State. 11:10, meeting with the Parliamentary Private Secretary to the Prime Minister. And so it went on. At 10 a.m, he wandered past her desk and into his office, the lame excuse being, "Oh, I was picked up late by my driver. Sorry about that." Carolina had heard that one before. It was double talk for I was still in bed with the latest mistress and lost track of time. "So what have I missed, oh guardian of my diary?" He smiled at her, already knowing the answer. Carolina was not in the mood for his funny quips this morning. She was angry, and it came across. Slowly and deliberately, she read out the missed appointments with the media and TV interview, not forgetting the excuses she had put in place for him, once again covering his arse. He'd been called away urgently and sent his apologies, etc., etc. "You're such a gem, Carolina. Where would I be without you and your efficiency?" "Probably sacked eventually," she responded caustically, now past caring. "Your next meeting is at 10:20 with the Permanent Under Secretary." He huffed at that one. Had he prepared for it? No. Fortunately, Carolina had, and gave him all the notes he needed. He had the grace to look chastised this time and gave mumbled thanks. Within the hour, she had managed to get her schedule back on track. The biggest bouquet of flowers from Covent Garden now stood on her desk with a handwritten note. "We'll try and do better next time. Oh, and could you buy my wife something unusual for her birthday tomorrow? You know her favourite shops, and you can charge it to my account. While you're at it, could you get a trinket for my favourite woman of the moment?" He'd finish with a flourishing signature and a big smiley emoticon. Carolina smiled in spite of herself, but was also left wondering if the grief was worth the £40,000 salary. She had a very small mortgage thanks to the job, and a perfect flat in the centre of London overlooking the Thames. However, the daily stress of this current minister was driving her nuts. She couldn't deny his charismatic charm, but she was getting fed up with constantly covering his arse. How did he hold down the job, for goodness sake? Carolina decided to go to the park for lunch. She needed the fresh air, time to think, and to clear her head. Frequently she fed her sandwiches to the ducks, but today she ate them all while she pondered her quandary. Should she seek a transfer to another department? She had always loved the job she was doing. It was just this current minister that was throwing her mind into turmoil. There was no denying he was a looker, but she usually didn't mix business with pleasure. Oh, if she could just sit and write all day, she mused. Unbeknown to her colleagues, she had many successful novels to her name under a pseudonym to maintain her anonymity. Okay, if she was honest, her job paid good money, but the writing world was precarious. You were only as good as your last book, her publisher had once told her. But these days, they were chasing her for the next one. She loved the world of romance and fantasy, and her books were mostly of that genre. She often dreamt about sailing the high seas with the likes of Johnny Depp, and would happily be his mistress, as in Pirates of the Caribbean. It was light relief and escapism from her current job. She was an attractive woman, she knew that because she had been told often enough. Her long black raven hair framed her porcelain face, whilst the long natural lashes teased anyone who tried to look into her bright blue eyes. Neither was she short of offers for dinner dates. However, her preference was to indulge herself in her writing and fantasy worlds. Sighing, Carolina walked back to her office, stopping only to admire the powerhouse, known as the Houses of Parliament. Yes, she actually worked in there, and sometimes had to pinch herself as a reminder. There was also the prestige which she enjoyed. Caroline wasn't greedy, but did love her current lifestyle, and who could blame her? In just a couple of hours, she will be back at her luxurious flat, which meant total relaxation with that lovely view. Oh, and it was a view to die for. Then she remembered the handwritten notes with her flowers. Oh, blast, she murmured under her breath. His trust in her was phenomenal. Never checking receipts. Oh, just charge it, Carolina. Fortunately for him, she was a completely honest individual right through. It wasn't worth being any other way. Carolina had done a passing taxi to take her to Tiffany's in Bond Street, which she usually used for these occasions. She hurriedly bought a couple of suitable trinkets for his wife and mistress. They didn't appeal to her, but his wife and mistress would love them. They were a snip at just under £800 in total. She picked up a suitable birthday card and returned to the office. You are an absolute treasure with exquisite taste, Carolina, and thank you. My women will love those, Jonathan gushed. Carolina decided against responding and went back to her desk to carry on earning her 40 grand. Chapter 2. A steaming hot shower always worked for Caroline when she got home. It cleansed her of all the bullshit that went on within the work environment. Mostly, she stayed out of it, but occasionally it impacted on her department. Then, of course, there was the usual gossip as to who was knocking off his secretary or minister, not forgetting who was the last to leave the bar and whether they had been sober or not. She dressed in her favourite tracksuit before cooking spaghetti bolognese. Then, sipping her wine, she walked over to the small bijou balcony of her flat to watch the activity on the Thames. The bridge had just lifted to allow a large boat entry. In the distance, she could hear the sound of the bow bells. It truly was a view to die for. But just then the telephone rang, bringing her back to the present. Hello, Carolina speaking. Carolina, it's Mary, your Aunt Jane's neighbour. I got your number from her list on the kitchen wall. I'm afraid I have a bit of bad news. Mary let Carolina digest that bit first. She's had a bit of a fall and is in hospital at the moment. I'm visiting her every day, but she's really quite poorly. Oh no, not poor Aunt Jane. It wasn't possible. She was so agile and carefree. Your aunt has told me all about you and your job in London. I can keep you updated if it will save you coming down here at the moment. I promise I will let you know if anything changes. I would much prefer to come down, Mary, but if you're sure she's not too bad, I'll come down at the weekend to see her. That will be fine. I'll tell her tomorrow when I visit. Carolina sorted out the details, including visiting times with Mary, and agreed to meet her at the hospital on Saturday. Aunt Jane was invincible and would be up and about before she knew it. A phone call was made to the hospital asking for a message to be passed on, stating that she would be down to visit and to give Aunt Jane her love. There was nothing more she could do at the moment, and she dished up her meal. The magnificent view from her balcony was forgotten now. On Saturday morning, Carolina did without her regular lay-in in favour of an early drive. The hospital was well signposted once she reached Hastings, and she maintained good time. Parking was another matter. Most of the spaces had already been taken up with staff and other visitors. As Carolina walked through the vast entrance, the clinical odours of the hospital played havoc with her nose, but she tried to ignore them. Reaching the woman's surgical ward, inquiries were made after her aunt. You must be Carolina, said a woman approaching her in a starched blue uniform. Would you like to join me in my office? It's a bit more comfortable in there and we can have a chat about your aunt. How is she? Carolina inquired as the ward sister held open a door. Would you like to sit here, my dear? Indicating a soft plush chair, seemingly ignoring her inquiry completely. The sister settled behind her desk and, forming a steeple with her fingers, looked at Carolina. It was never easy trying to gauge the best way to break the news. Many times she had been the bearer of bad news, and it never got any easier regardless of what anyone said. I'm afraid the news is not good, my dear. She waited for a reaction. I'm afraid your aunt died just a short while ago. She waited again for a moment or two. Her age was against her, you see. The broken bones had been contributory to it. Carolina was devastated. No, it wasn't possible. Not her lovely Aunt Jane. Why was life so unfair? Then she began to chastise herself for putting a job first and not coming immediately. At least she could have held her hand and said goodbye to her. A box of tissues was passed over, which she made use of. I'm so sorry, my dear. We ensured she was in no pain. She just slipped quietly away. That was so typical of Aunt Jane, never one to make a fuss, thought Carolina. The ward sister was talking again. Her friend Mary came with a gentleman to visit this morning, but they also were too late, I'm afraid. The gentleman seemed very close to her. She was querying something, but Carolina knew nothing about any special men in her aunt's life. Probably someone from Derby and Joan Club, she surmised. Can I get you a drink of something, my dear? Water, tea, coffee, or something a bit stronger? I have a small bottle of brandy here for such situations, if you would prefer. Caroline thanked her, but rejected everything. She wanted to see her aunt if it was allowed. Then she changed her mind and opted for the brandy. She sipped it slowly as she hadn't eaten and was driving later. It burnt her throat, but it also gave her courage to see her aunt for the last time. There were no living relatives apart from her, which meant the funeral arrangements would be down to her. "I'll get a nurse to take you along to the Chapel of Rest as soon as you're ready." She then left her to come to terms with the news. The Chapel of Rest was silent and very peaceful when she walked in. Carolina sat in one of the pews gathering her courage. She could see her aunt quite clearly and suddenly felt the urge to go up and touch her, mostly to reassure herself that she was really gone. Slightly shaking, she went up and gazed down on her. The hair was perfect as always, and she looked sound asleep. Part of her hoped that her aunt would suddenly start snoring, then the nightmare could just be a dream. Carolina touched her face. It was stone cold. Feeling her eyes welling up, she dropped a kiss on her aunt's forehead, said her goodbye and walked out to the car. She felt awful leaving her there, but there was nothing she could do. Sitting in the driving seat, Carolina woke up again as she thought about her aunt's life. Jane had lived a very long and full life, 80 years old, and she still had all her marbles, with an eye for the men in the twice-weekly Derby and Joan Club. Her hair was always immaculate, and she dressed to kill. Well, maybe more like a bit of overage flirting, if truth be told. But life was for living, and she lived it to the full. She also loved a small tipple of brandy every night, but an extra glass over her quota had left her unsteady on her feet and caused a nasty fall down the stairs after a trip to the bathroom. Carolina drove back to London and was offered compassionate leave from work. She knew the temporary replacement Frances Strong by reputation only, not a woman to try and take advantage of by all counts. Frances apparently lived up to her surname. It wasn't the best choice in her opinion, but she was all they had. Hopefully she will be immune to the charismatic Jonathan Taylor and keep him in some sort of order. However, whether she did or not was the least of her worries at the moment. She would make her aunt's cottage her temporary home until everything was finalised. Within her aunt's effect, there was a key to the cottage, which she had slipped on her key fob. The cottage seemed sort of lonely somehow, and for comfort she slept in her aunt's perfectly made bed. It was the best night's sleep she had had for weeks. Maybe it was the sea air, but she also felt her aunt was close by. The following morning, Carolina unpacked a few things and tried to settle. She had no idea how long the formalities would take before the funeral could be arranged, but the solicitors had taken over most of the arrangements for her. Everyone, it seemed, wanted to lend a hand. As Carolina wandered from room to room of the 17th century cottage, childhood memories came flooding back. She was Hastings born and bred, just like the proverbial stick of rock. Her name seemed to be embedded through it. Her parents had named her after one of her paternal ancestors, and at no time had anyone ever shortened it. Education had been in the local convent by nuns after winning a scholarship. That had certainly been an experience, one she had no wish to recall at any time. Her thoughts drifted away from her regimented childhood and back to the present. How her life had changed when finally she had moved to the high life of the metropolis. Her parents had taken up permanent residence abroad in the holiday villa in Italy at the same time. Suddenly her aunt's words came back to her, bringing her back to the present. It's steeped in its own history and secrets, my dear. Once everything was settled, Carolina was determined to research into it all. Although classed as a small end-of-terrace house, they had always referred to it as the cottage, so full of memories, and her resolve was strengthened. "I won't change anything, Aunt Jane, I promise," she murmured to the cottage, and it creaked as if in acknowledgement. Carolina stepped out to the bath and closed the open window, shutting out the salty air. Her body was wrapped in a large fluffy towel as the bath water drained off. Then she slipped into her CE monogrammed white dressing gown and toweling slippers before making her way downstairs. As she reached the curve of the wide landing, which accommodated her larger tall plants, she was convinced she heard a soft chuckle, but put it down to house settling noises. The 2 glasses of Merlot consumed in the bath was probably another reason for hearing weird noises. She placed the bottle and glass on the table and then checked that the kitchen and front doors were both locked before retiring to bed. Carolina was sleeping deeply now, as the history of the cottage continued to be made. Sitting in the soft bedroom chair under the window, the invisible occupant of the property watched over her protectively.